It's really something, you start to think, okay, you're getting a handle on global trade, you're understanding the flow of things, and then suddenly everything changes, like someone ripped up the map and redrew it overnight.
Yeah.
What we've been witnessing, though, is not just a tweak here and there. It feels more like, I don't know, a tectonic shift, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right. The pace and the scale of these recent changes, I mean, in international trade policy are truly extraordinary. I think it really demands a much closer look if we're going to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
And that's exactly what we're setting out to do today. So welcome to this deep dive into the very latest developments in Donald Trump's tariff policies during his second term as of today, April 9th, 2025. We're going to basically try to unpack a timeline of events. It's been a fast-moving situation, a lot happening in a very short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've done is we've collected a whole range of sources for you, everything from his, official statements on Truth Social, the executive orders that have been issued and a variety of news reports, really trying to get a comprehensive picture. And what we're hoping to do is kind of distill all this information, break it down so we can all understand what are the key actions that have been taken, what are the stated motivations behind them, and what are some of the immediate reactions we've seen on the global stage.
So what we're trying to do is give you the most important insights without getting too bogged down in, all those complex, economics details. Because I think sometimes you can get lost in the weeds with that stuff.
Right.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We need to go back a bit to understand how these policies started, come together, how they were formed.
Absolutely. I think we can trace the beginnings even before President Trump's second inauguration. If you remember, on November 25th of last year, he actually signaled his intentions on tariffs via Truth Social.
Yeah, that's right. He specifically mentioned, I think it was a 10% tariff on goods coming from China, right? And then a much higher, a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. I think what was interesting then was that he linked these potential tariffs, right, directly to concerns around border security and also the flow of fentanyl into the country. And, at that point, it wasn't really clear what specific legal authority he was planning to use to put these into effect. That caused a bit of a stir, I think.
Right. It definitely telegraphed a policy direction. But yeah, you're right. The exact mechanisms for implementing it, that was still up in the air. And then, of course, we come to January 20th, 2025, the first day back in office for him. Big day.
Yeah. Pivotal day, yeah. And there was the pretty immediate action, right? That's the day he signed that executive order, the one that directed his cabinet to produce reports and recommendations related to trade and tariffs. And they had a deadline of April 1st, so, basically about 3 months to get those reports in. And I think his objective there was, his aim was pretty clear. I think there was a quote where he talked about using tariffs as a way to enrich our citizens by taxing foreign countries. So that signaled a very particular approach to international trade, didn't it?
It did. It really kind of positioned tariffs as a proactive tool, I guess, for economic benefit. At least that's how the administration viewed it, rather than simply as a, defensive measure as it had been used traditionally. And this really set the stage for what we saw happen in February, which was, I guess, the first phase of, putting these ideas into practice and also broadening the scope to, include a wider range of countries that were being targeted.
And February 1st, that was a pretty significant day. I mean, we saw executive orders being issued that actually invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's IEEPA, as it's called. And that was the legal instrument used to actually put those, previously announced tariffs into effect. And those went live, if you like, on February 4th. So the 25% on Canada and Mexico, that was linked to immigration and drug concerns, although, there was a bit of a carve-out there. A slightly lower 10% tariff was applied to Canadian energy imports. Yeah. And then, we also saw that 10% tariff on goods from China taking effect at that point. IEEPA, that's a pretty hefty piece of legislation, isn't it, to invoke in this context?
It really is. I mean, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, that grants the president, it gives him quite sweeping powers, really, to regulate commerce during times that are declared national emergencies. So using it in this particular situation, I think, is notable because it really signals that the administration views this trade situation as a genuine national emergency. And that kind of gives them the ability to take these rapid and significant actions that, probably wouldn't be possible under, the usual mechanisms of trade law.
So really crucial context there. Thanks for clarifying that. So we're in February, right? And then just a day later, on February 2nd, we started to hear signals that this tariff strategy was going to expand even further, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The European Union was specifically mentioned as a potential target. That was interesting. Tariffs on EU goods pretty soon was the phrase that was used, and even the United Kingdom was brought into the conversation. Although there was some suggestion that, tariffs in that case might be, negotiable, potentially linked to the ongoing trade discussions that were already happening. So that was, a hint that this trade policy landscape, it was becoming very dynamic. It was shifting all the time.
Extremely dynamic. And then, around the middle of February, specifically on the 13th, we saw a shift towards what was being called a fair and reciprocal plan. And that was accompanied by a presidential memorandum. And this whole idea of reciprocal tariffs that seems to be kind of central to the administration's thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this memorandum basically directed staff, the administration staff, to conduct this pretty comprehensive review of international trade barriers. And it wasn't just limited to tariffs. They were looking at things like, exchange rates, overall trade balances. And the goal was really to come up with custom, country-specific reciprocal tariffs. So they were looking at tailoring these to each country, and they had a deadline of April 1st to have that ready to go. And the principle behind all of this was basically countries that have higher barriers for U.S. goods, well, they're going to face higher tariffs on their exports to the U.S.
So the focus was kind of evolving here, wasn't it? Moving away from just targeting specific countries based on certain issues and going to something more like a universal approach with the aim of, I guess, as the administration saw it, creating a level playing field, on a country-by-country basis. Then we enter March. And I think March is when we really started to see the pace pick up.
Yeah.
There were quite a lot of sector-specific tariffs being imposed, quite rapidly.
Right. And so on March 4th, there was another, immediate increase in tariffs on China, an additional 10% that was added, taking the total tariff rate on Chinese goods to 20%. And that was explicitly framed as a response to what the U.S. saw as retaliatory measures from China after the earlier round of tariffs.
Right. And then that focus on specific industries, that really intensified on March 12th, I think. We saw some pretty hefty increases in tariffs on steel and aluminum. So steel tariffs were raised to a minimum of 25% on all imports, and they actually removed some exemptions that had been in place before. And aluminum tariffs, those jumped from 10% to 25%. So there, the stated goal was pretty clearly to boost domestic production in those key industrial sectors.
Yeah. And then a couple of weeks later, March 26th, the automotive industry, that became kind of the center of attention. There was an announcement of a 25% tariff on all non-U.S. manufactured automobiles. That was a big one.
Yeah.
And the administration was projecting that this could, potentially generate around $100 billion in revenue. And there was a lot of talk about the Made in America initiative, really pushing that.
Right. And by the time we got to the end of March, around March 31st, we started to see some reports, and these were suggesting that this reciprocal tariff plan, it was actually, potentially going even further than many people had initially thought.
Yeah.
It was starting to look like it might apply to all nations, not just the ones that had these, big trade imbalances with the U.S. So that wider scope, that really started to generate some significant concerns within the economic community.
It did. I mean, we saw reports from Goldman Sachs where they really increased their estimated probability of a recession in the U.S., And they were also forecasting a pretty notable rise in inflation. And those are, serious indicators, in terms of the potential negative consequences of these widespread tariff increases.
Absolutely. And then this all kind of leads us up to April, which is when we saw this rather dramatic Liberation Day announcement, as it was called.
Right. So April 1st, that was the deadline for finalizing that, comprehensive reciprocal tariff plan. And then on April 2nd, this is the day that some dubbed Liberation Day, we saw a major unveiling, a major policy announcement. So first of all, a national emergency was declared in relation to the trade deficit. And once again, IEEP was invoked.
Wow.
But this time, it was used to implement a 10% baseline tariff on, get this, all imports. And that was set to take effect on April 5th. So, this is a pretty sweeping measure. We're talking about essentially like a flat tax on just about everything coming into the country.
It's a very, very broad stroke, yeah. Although there were some notable exceptions carved out to that initial 10% baseline. So, imports from Canada and Mexico, those were exempt.
Right.
Also, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, copper, lumber, energy products, and a few other specific categories.
But on top of that baseline, there were also higher reciprocal tariffs announced. And these were targeted at 57 countries, set to come into effect on April 9th, just a few days later.
And those reciprocal rates, they were pretty significant, weren't they? I
Yeah.
mean, for China, the total tariff burden, if you include those earlier increases, was going to hit a pretty staggering 54%. And then, the European Union, they were facing a 20% rate, Japan at 24%, India at 26%, and Vietnam, that was a particularly high one, I think, at 46%. And then there was a kind of a range of rates for other nations, places like South Africa, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Fiji, Taiwan, South Korea. And all through this, President Trump, his justification remained pretty consistent. He was talking about decades of what he saw as unfair trade practices, and he continued to express his optimism about an economic boom in the U.S. as a result of all this, even though, there were pretty clear signs of concern from global markets.
Right. And as expected, April 5th came around, and that's when that 10% baseline tariff came into effect. And that really did represent a pretty significant departure from the sort of established international trade order that we've all been used to since World War II. But of course, the story didn't end there.
No, not at all. And then on April 7th, with China's previously announced, I think it was a 34% retaliatory tariffs sort of looming on the horizon, President Trump escalated things even further. He threatened to slap an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods if Beijing didn't roll back those duties by April 8th. And as we now know, that immediate rollback didn't happen.
Which brings us to today, April 9th. And things have taken a pretty dramatic turn in the last few hours, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Big news.
Yeah.
President Trump went back to his favorite platform, Truth Social, and made a major announcement. There's going to be an immediate increase in tariffs on goods from China. And it's a pretty huge jump. It's going all the way up to 125%. That is a really massive escalation of, trade pressure on China.
Yeah. But then almost at the same time, there was this other really significant announcement. And this one affects the vast majority of other U.S. trading partners.
Yeah, you're right. There's going to be a 90-day pause on those higher reciprocal tariffs. So that affects most other countries. And those tariffs are being temporarily reduced to that 10% baseline rate. And China is the very notable exception to this pause.
So what you're saying is for the majority of nations that were facing those higher reciprocal tariffs, there's this sudden, if temporary, reprieve. What reasons were given for this rather surprising pause?
Well, in the announcement, they specifically mentioned the recent market sell-offs and also, expressions of concern that they've been getting from their international partners. So that suggests that maybe they're making a tactical adjustment here, maybe trying to ease some of that pressure from their key allies and partners while, keeping the pressure on China. It could be that they're hoping to use this 90-day window to, really engage in some serious negotiations with these other countries.
And what about President Trump's messaging on China?
Well, his message on China was pretty direct. He kind of doubled down on his view that they've been ripping off the USA. And, regarding the other countries, he basically said that over 75 countries had actually reached out to try and negotiate. And he also said that they had all refrained from retaliating against the U.S. because of, his strong suggestion. And he even went so far as to publicly thank these nations for, paying attention to the administration's concerns. So it's a pretty assertive, an unconventional approach to international trade relations.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
I think it's interesting to look at how India has responded. I think their response has been particularly measured. Initially, they were facing a 26% reciprocal tariff, but their Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson, they've been emphasizing that the ongoing bilateral trade deal negotiations, those are continuing with the United States. So they're not kind of pulling back from that.
Right. And what's been the spokesperson's take on this?
Well, the spokesperson, has said that they're carefully studying the implications of these tariffs. And they've also said that discussions are ongoing with U.S. trade teams with the aim of finalizing a trade agreement that's, mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
So it could be that this 90-day pause will give them some valuable breathing room for those discussions to make some progress. And it could also, potentially offer some stability to Indian markets, at least in the short term.
Yeah. I think this whole sequence of events really does raise some questions about the overall strategy here. The rapid fire shifts and then the sudden pause for most countries. I mean, is this a flip-flop on policy? Or is it maybe a calculated maneuver? You've got to wonder what the businesses and the markets are making of all this. The uncertainty must be huge. We've heard this administration talk in the past about how, you have to go through some short-term economic pain for long-term gain. And then they do something like this pause, which seems to contradict that whole idea.
Exactly. And it begs the question, were these tariffs ever meant to be permanent across the board?
Yeah.
Or were they, always intended as more of a lever to force other countries to the negotiating table on terms that are more favorable to the U.S.?
Yeah.
I mean, we've definitely had mixed messages from the administration on this point in the past.
Definitely. It's interesting. I saw a quote from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and he was quoted as saying this was President Trump's strategy all along, and that he basically, and I quote, goaded China into a bad position. So that's an interesting interpretation. It kind of suggests that there's a deliberate, maybe even intentionally disruptive long-term plan at play here.
Right. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second and try to pull out some of the key themes we're seeing emerging from all of this, because there's a lot to digest. So the first thing I think that's clear is that there's been a pretty significant evolution in the administration's approach to trade policy. We've gone from targeting specific countries and specific sectors to something much broader, with a real emphasis on this idea of reciprocity in trade relationships. Mirroring or exceeding those trade barriers that U.S. exporters face, that seems to be at the heart of what they're doing.
Yeah. And the stated objectives behind all these policies, they're complex, they're multifaceted. I mean, you can see the aim of trying to revitalize U.S. manufacturing. There's no question about that. And reducing the trade deficit, that's a big one. But also, particularly in those initial stages, with the focus on Canada and Mexico, there was this clear attempt to link tariffs to things like immigration and the flow of illegal drugs into the country. So there's a political element to this as well.
No question. And then you look at the global reactions, and, they've been quite varied. China's taken a pretty strong stance with retaliation. Other trading partners have been expressing concern. Some have even threatened, potential countermeasures. And you see that reflected in the markets, right? You've seen all that volatility, those big sell-offs in global markets. And that really underscores just how much uncertainty there is around the economic impact of all of this.
Absolutely. But, I think it's also important to acknowledge that we have seen some instances of what you might call flexibility, or maybe strategic adjustments in how the administration's approaching all of this. The fact that they've granted some exemptions both for certain countries and for certain sectors, and also these recent pauses and delays. I think that suggests that they are paying attention to the potential economic fallout, and maybe they're willing to use these measures as more of a bargaining chip in those ongoing negotiations.
It's interesting. It kind of suggests that while, the overall direction seems to be clearly towards a more protectionist trade stance, the actual implementation of it's more fluid. It's more subject to change based on, how other countries react and also what's happening in the domestic economy.
Yeah. So let's sum up where we are. Right now, as of this moment, we've seen this incredibly rapid and substantial escalation of tariffs, most notably with China, culminating in this unprecedented 125% rate.
Right.
And of course, that's in stark contrast to the temporary suspension of the higher reciprocal tariffs for most other major U.S. trading partners. They're only subject to that 10% baseline tariff, for now at least.
It's really quite an extraordinary situation when you look at it in the context of global trade since World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, we just haven't seen this kind of speed, this magnitude of policy shifts in recent decades. It's really remarkable.
Which leads us to a really, really crucial question. And, I want to put this out to all of you listening. Given this abrupt and dramatic shift, the pressure on China increasing while things ease up a bit for most other nations, what do you think this means? Is this a genuine strategic pivot towards a more maybe nuanced approach to negotiation? Or is this just a brief pause in what's going to be a much longer, much more unpredictable trade war, a conflict that could have far-reaching consequences? And then, thinking even more broadly, what could be some of the unintended consequences of these really sweeping and rapidly implemented policy changes?
Because the global economy, it's all interconnected, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be a ripple effect.
Exactly. The next 90 days, it's going to be fascinating to watch how this all plays out. Will these aggressive trade actions actually lead to some meaningful negotiations? I don't know. But one thing's for sure, the implications for the entire global economic landscape are going to be huge. They're going to be lasting.